Omer. Happy Purim. Today is a special day. Today we're celebrating the feast of Purim, which according to the Hebrew calendar actually begins this evening and tomorrow all day. And this second day, there are celebrations in the synagogues throughout the world and here in Montreal. Do you know that we have over 85 synagogues here? They organize parties. The children dress up with very colorful costumes depicting either Esther, Mordechai, or even Haman. They also eat, by the way, what is a Jewish holiday without food, right? Even Yom Kippur, they eat before a lot and they eat after a lot, right? And they especially eat hamatashins. That is a cookie made in the form of a hat, the hat of Haman, the villain of the story, something we will serve in the foyer after the service. So what is this feast all about? Let us open our scriptures to the book of Esther. Another book that we find by faith, of course. So if you go from left to right, you have Psalm, Job, Esther. The book bears the title Megillah Esther, or the book of Esther, also known simply as Megillah. That is the book, for it stands tall and it is bold in its style. So much so that some wanted to remove it from the scriptures. In the overall, Purim speaks of God's sovereignty, of his supremacy and dominion over all history, even though his name is not mentioned in this book, in the book of Esther. In fact, Esther is the only book of the Bible where the name of God is not mentioned. And if his name is not mentioned, it's because this book is wholly concerned with Israel outside of her land, in the diaspora, within the nations of the world as it is today. It is the story that is behind what Paul says in Romans 11:25, where he says that covering in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. This veil over Israel is often interpreted as a rejection where God forsakes her and replaces her. But Esther will correct this view. While his name is never mentioned in this book, he is so present at every turn, at every attempt against his people. And there's a great practical aspect for believers today in these writings. Have you ever felt isolated, even abandoned? This book, I want to tell you, is for you. It will teach us about God's omnipresence, infinite and limitless love and presence everywhere, anywhere his own are. If you're a believer, know that he's always present with you and that he will never forsake you. This is Esther's message for us today. So the story in the book is very simple. It's about a person of great importance in the Medo-Persian kingdom who feels lost. The man, by the way, magnificent thought he was. And so this man Haman set precedents for the hundreds of years to follow in the history of the diaspora of Israel until Yeshua comes back. Let me situate you in history. This story takes place after that Daniel gave his prophecy about the four world kingdom that shapes the history, that shaped and is shaping the history of mankind. This is found in Daniel chapter 2 and 7. The first was Babylon, the Babylonian Empire represented by a lion. The second, the Medo-Persian Empire, represented by a bear, a ferocious one. The third was the Greek Empire, represented by a leopard. And the fourth was indescribable. It began with the Roman Empire, but John in chapter 13 of Revelation speaks of it as a final empire led by the Antichrist, which I believe is in the making today. The one present in Esther is the second one, the Medo-Persian, represented by the big bear. It is within this kingdom that the story of Purim takes place. 70 years later, according to Jeremiah's prophecy, some Jews began to return to Israel to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. And God sent them prophets, great prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, to encourage them. But the majority of the people did not want to move out of Persia. They were too comfortable. What happens when people don't want to move? When God's people become too comfortable in a place they are not supposed to be, he allows persecution to move the people. Esther is a big persecution we're going to find in there, and one that is so aggressive and merciless. It marked the history of Israel. This is why it became a feast. After this persecution, men and women of God were moved. Less than 10 years later, Ezra and Nehemiah, along with 50,000 Jews, returned to the land to build Jerusalem and the temple in order to prepare it for the first coming of the Messiah. And the way the book is written, I want to tell you, is exceptional, remarkable. It's rare. It is rare. We don't find anything like this in other parts of the scriptures. Esther is what we might call a tragic comedy, a blend of tragic and also comic situations. Within this very serious problem of anti-Semitism and plots of mass murder, this book is also very comic. It's funny as unexpected events arise out of nowhere. God, I want to tell you, has a great sense of humor. And I want to tell you, it's fun. It's fun to read your scriptures. Now let's go to the text right away and begin to see this story. You know, as you open up the first page and you enter the book of Esther, you're brought right into the lavish lifestyle of the king of Persia of the time, King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes. Reading the account, one might even be surprised of the highly descriptive words used to depict this sumptuous palace. For a couple of verses, you may even wonder if this is really the Bible. If it is a Bible you are reading or an account from the annals of the history of Persia. Now let us begin to read and try to figure out why this information is given to us. Let's read the first 4 verses. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was Ahasuerus who reigned over 120 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat in the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. This, I want to tell you, is a great introduction to the king of Ahasuerus and what he achieved. He was a very successful king, for his kingdom was from India to Ethiopia, literally all the main populated areas in the world at this time. Daniel even described this empire as a ferocious bear who devoured much flesh, that is. This we find it in Daniel chapter 7. He also described it as a mighty ram with 2 horns, which he says no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. And notice how this monarchy is described in verse 4. It says a glorious kingdom. The Hebrew word for glorious is kabod, where the word kadosh or holy is derived, a word usually reserved to God in other parts of the scriptures. Notice also that it says about his magnificence, it says the splendor of his excellent majesty. You know, these are also words, strong words, excellent majesty. These words are only attributed to God by David. And in the next verses, the Spirit enhances even the more the great splendor of his kingdom. He gives us a tour, actually, of the palace. And I wanted to ask you, why so much information and so many details about a Persian palace? White and blue linen curtains, couches of gold and silver and cups made of gold, and the marble stones everywhere. Does that ring a bell? Why do you think this is given to us here? All of this must have spoken to every Jew living in this kingdom, because as you consider all these things, a message emerges that is a very powerful message. We're not the same colors used in the temple of God, as we read in Exodus, God's temple that was just destroyed. Have you noticed the main colors, the blue, purple, and white? But these 3 colors are mentioned together 30 times. Just from Exodus 25 till the end, to describe the temple, the tabernacle of God. What are they doing here, and where is the temple of God? Is this why we're giving so many details, so to see that the people of God missed out because of their unbelief? It was not supposed to be like this. What a contrast. Here we see that we are at a point in time where a foreign idolatrous nation was enjoying what was supposed to belong to God and to his people. Something has gone wrong in the process of time. The first 9 verses of Esther chapter 1 presents us with a marked reverse of order. Because the diaspora, the time of the Gentiles had begun, a new phase in the history of Israel had begun then. This is how the book of Esther begins, with this bitter irony. While God's house lay in rule in Jerusalem and his people were out in captivity, the other seems to be winning, but the story, I want to tell you, just began. Just began. The irony just began. You know, some midrashim, ancient rabbinical interpretations, saw the resemblance with the temple back in Jerusalem, and they came out with a story. They concluded that Ahasuerus wished to sit on the throne of Solomon, but since he wasn't able to, he commissioned his architect to fashion one like it, but it turned out to be a bad copy. Not sure Ahasuerus ever seen the Temple of Solomon, but these writers caught the gist of the story. Both places resemble each other, and this is the message here. But this is not the whole picture. In the following verses, the veil is slowly lifted up, and the true reality of this kingdom is revealed to us. What comes next in Esther is truly unexpected. The big bear meets his match. Not another empire, but a woman who defiantly stood her ground and was about to crush his kingdom. This is ironic, for in this history, the history of these people, you don't hear much about the role of women. In fact, as in most other histories, however, it is not so in the Bible, especially in the book of Esther. In fact, there are 4 women, 4 of them, described in the book of Esther. Let me present to you the 4 wives. The first one is Queen Vashti. She takes the main role in chapter 1, an exceptionally courageous woman who refused to let her husband, the great king, abuse her. She will open the story for us. The second one was instrumental in changing the course of the history of the Jewish people, Esther, from where the name of the feast we're studying. In her Hebrew name in Hadassah, meaning myrtle, an evergreen tree, which became a star. This is what Esther means. Of her character and physical beauty, the Spirit says in chapter 2, verse 7, that the young woman was lovely and beautiful. That is rare in the scriptures where the physical beauty of someone is brought out. But this God-given beauty opened the doors to the king's palace, where she actually saved the people of Israel. The third woman is Zeresh, Haman's wife, the villain of the story. Zeresh was a wise woman. She is portrayed as one who stood by her husband, as wicked and silly as he was. She reminds us of Abigail. Do you remember the wife of Nadab, who acted so irrationally, but she saved him? She may also remind us of the wife of Pontius Pilate, Claudia, who advised her husband not to touch the righteous men. Both Nadab, or all of them, Nadab, Pilate, and Haman, had this in common. They did not listen to the advice of their wives. Now, the fourth one is a special woman. And like the other, this woman is a nation, the nation of Israel. She is the wife of Jehovah. We seldom speak of Israel as the wife of Jehovah, but she is often depicted as such, especially in the book of Hosea and elsewhere. And in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, she is the woman who gives birth to the Messiah and is subject to great persecution. In Esther, she appears as a desperate wife, but in truth, her husband follows her everywhere and makes sure she lacks nothing, as he does today as well. This book is really about her long journey away from home, and her homecoming to her husband at the end. This is also the story of Esther. Let us now see what happens when Queen Vashti, the story changes drastically with her appearance. Her name in Persia means beautiful. Beautiful she must have been, because after that her husband, King Ahasuerus, organized a great feast, we see in chapter 1. And after drinking much wine, and he asked her to appear in front of his hundreds of male. Look at chapter 1, verse 11. He asked her to appear in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But he was out for a surprise. The big bear was not that big, and the powerful ram could not go past Vashti. After a feast which lasted 6 months plus 1 week, and the last day of the week, as a finale, Ahasuerus asked Vashti to come and appear before his guest, perhaps to dance. In fact, the rabbis thought that it was their wedding, but Vashti refused to go. This, I want to tell you, was a tragedy because no one refuses the great king, the great and powerful king, yet his wife doesn't listen to him. What a joke, right? Now it's starting to sound like our scriptures. Now the story begins to look like our Bible. The Persian could never dare write this part of their history in their records. This is the difference between the history of the Bible and the other histories. The histories of the scriptures are written by God. It is open and sincere and true. Not so the history of the nations. You read about them, you think that they're supermen, all of them. And here Vashti's action has such an impact in the empire that the king's advisor were afraid that she might crash actually the whole kingdom. Imagine, a woman was about to cause the collapse of the Medo-Persian Empire. Look at verse 17. After her refusal, the king's advisor were worried about the situation, so they voiced their concern. He said, for the queen's behavior will become known to all the women, so that they will despise their husband in their eyes when they report. King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. They were afraid that all the women of the kingdom will now be against their husbands. These Persians won over all the armies of the world, but they couldn't get their women. Okay, that's the irony of the whole thing. And so they were forced to write a decree. In verse 22, look at this decree. A decree to force the women to listen to their husbands. It says, then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak the language of his own people. They needed to write a law to command that men were masters in their own house, because they really were not. This is how the chapter ends. This part with Vashti was short but powerful. We do not know what happened to Vashti. The rabbis think she was executed, but the scriptures just tell us that she was demoted. But this is not the whole story. There's something else. King Ahasuerus, the terrible bear, the powerful ram, deep inside, he was a sentimental guy, right? Look at chapter 2, verse 1. It says, after these things, when the wrath of the king Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she has done and what he had decreed against her. Okay, the verb remember in the Hebrew tense is in the qual, right? This tense is used to show an inner mental, a time of pondering and thinking. Ahasuerus was sentimental, for he remembered Vashti. He was in love. After all, the poor guy, they took out his wife. And if it was really his wedding, really, we can understand his pain, right? So to soothe his unbearable heartbreak, they looked for a replacement. And this is where Esther comes in. Now let us pause for a moment. So far, looking back at all this information, we are reminded of a truth that we find in Psalm chapter 2, verse 4. He who sits in the heaven shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. Drinking from golden cups and laying in ivory crutches, was just a show which became a lost memory. God laughs, and there must be so much laughter in heaven. By the way, laughter is divine. Right? We're going to laugh in heaven, and we can begin even now. In his book, Being a Good Dad When You Didn't Have One, Tim Wiseman gives his readers 2 pieces of advice. Lighten up. He says that adults laugh an average of 15 times a day, while children laugh about 400 times a day. Right? You see the difference? What happens when we grow up? This is a tremendous difference. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, we lose 385 laughs a day. That's a great loss. Maybe we need not only the faith of a child, but we need the funny bone, of one as well. Laughter is good for you. It stirs up the blood, expands the chest, electrifies the nerves. Read your Bible, and you're going to see. It's funny. There are a lot of funny things in there. And furthermore, we are told that laughter is the shortest distance between two people. Right? For us who are looking to share the good news of salvation of Yeshua, laughter is a great asset that we have to look for. Now back to Esther. Now the tragic comedy has just begun, as now we're coming to the heart of the story. We're going to meet two individuals who play a big role, Mordecai and Haman. Mordecai, who really has the same name as Paul, for both name means little men, one in Greek and the other one in Persian language. And both are from the tribe of Benjamin, and I'm glad that Saul came around, right? Because he's from Benjamin, but he's very tall. Otherwise, we would have thought that all Benjamins were short, right? So Mordecai was Esther's cousin who raised the orphan Esther as if she were his daughter. This man may have been little in stature, but not in faith. We're going to see how great of faith he was. Mordecai, like Daniel and Daniel's three friends, while in foreign land, were abiding by the law of God and refused to worship but God alone. It was his faith which unleashed the first persecution against all the Jews in the diaspora. See how it happened. Look at chapter 3, verse 2. It says, and all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman. For so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai will not bow or pay homage. Notice the two words, bow or pay homage. Literally, it means that they bent and they bowed down to the floor, something they did to the deities. The writers of the Targum of Esther understood the worship of a deity and imagined an image of an idol that Haman set in his chest. So everyone bowed to this image. Now, who is this man, Haman? This man was the second in command in the kingdom of Persia. However, he wasn't a Persian. He wasn't a Persian. In history, Persians were often favorable to the Jews. They lived well together, and it was Cyrus who helped Israel go back to their land at some point. Haman, it says in chapter 3, verse 1, he was an Agagite. Agagite, these peoples were descendants from whom? From Esau. The one who sold his birthright to Jacob. The irony keeps its course, as if he comes again to regain his lost privileges. The Bible portrays Edom as the enemy of Israel par excellence, right? Often the first to rise against Israel. And there he is. The rabbis that, by the way, called all enemies of Israel by the name of Edom, even the Romans. Another descendant of Esau was Herod, who also tried to regain his lost privileges as a firstborn. But not all descendants of Esau are against the people of God. We have seen these past weeks, right, that Caleb was also a descendant, and yet he was head of the tribe of Judah. God's grace defies all evil. And as Mordecai did not want to bow down to Haman, see now how Haman reacted. Now, deeply hurt, he went to complain to the king Ahasuerus, but pay attention to what he says. Chapter 3, verse 8. These words really sum up what anti-Semites have said since then and even now, from Mordecai, Haman, up till the end. This is their accusation. He says, there are certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other people, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. And in verse 13, he asked that letters should be sent by courier to all the king's provinces. To what? The end of verse 13. To kill and to annihilate all the Jews. And Haman even proposes to pay the king for the extermination of the Jews in chapter 9. I want to ask you, why this hatred? Where does it come from? Only Mordecai heard him. And this man wanted to annihilate not only Mordecai, but all the Jews of the kingdom. Does that make sense to you? This is one bitter irony. The Jews attracted the attention just like Moses predicted in Deuteronomy 28, just before they entered the land. He says, you shall get out after, right? You'll be an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among the nations, all the nations that the Lord will drive you. Esther is the beginning of this history. What we see here is something that we saw happening in history and we'll see in the future with the Antichrist. A state-organized annihilation of the Jews. Haman makes anti-Semitism the official government policy. Did not Hitler do the same thing about 70 years ago? And speaking of Hitler, by the way, I just want to tell you, lately his book, Mankind, was finally released after the copyright expired, and it sells sword. It was sold out as soon as it was put in the market. For my part, I wanted to know what kind of book would encourage the death of some 50 million people, what kind of idea, what kind of thoughts. What are these thoughts process which brings a man to be filled with such hatred? So about the book, and I want to tell you, it's very difficult reading. One can really perceive a disturbed mind. And there is one thing which stands out, which reminded me of Haman. Do you know how many times, by the way, in the book, he mentioned the name Jew or Jewish? 534 times. He was obviously obsessed and paranoid about the Jews. Perhaps like Haman here, and this is where one understands the spiritual dimension of this hatred. And there's one more thing which shows this magnitude. Do you know what triggered Hitler's hatred of the Jews? He says it. He clearly says it. You know, at the beginning he writes that he could not understand why the people are anti-Semitic. He did not remember his father saying anything bad about the Jews, but he gives the reason why he began to hate them. It is when they begin to speak about rebuilding the nation of Israel. Let me quote what he says. But any indecision which I may still have felt about anti-Semitism was finally removed by a great movement called Zionism, whose aim was to assert the national character of Judaism. What is his business? I want to ask. What was he disturbed about the Jews going back to their land? What difference does it make that the people want to go back to their country? This is where you understand the spiritual extent of anti-Semitism. At some point, it just doesn't make sense, and why the return of the Jews to Israel angers so many people, even today. Both Haman and Hitler seems to have been directed as pawns by this evil scheme from the evil one. Haman tried to annihilate the Jews, while many of them were in the land preparing the first coming of the Messiah. In the time with Haman, that is, was Haggai, Zechariah. They were there with Nehemiah after, and Ezra. You know, Hitler tried the same thing when Jews in Israel were preparing to go to the land. Actually, what Hitler succeeded in doing actually is to push the Jews into their land, like Haman. And anti-Semitism comes from very surprising sources as well. I want to mention this. You know, I mentioned before that some wanted to have the book of Esther out of the scriptures. One of them was the famous reformer Martin Luther, who had a big influence in the life, by the way, of Hitler. What I'm about to tell you is so seldom taught in church history books. Concerning Esther, Luther wrote, and I quote, he says, "I am so hostile to this book that I wish that it did not exist at all." How can one speak of a book of the Bible this way? And what made him think that he could remove not only Esther, but the book of James and the book of Revelation? By the way, do you know why he wanted to remove the book of Esther? He gives the reason. He says, "For it Judaizes too greatly and have much pagan and propriety," right? What he's saying is that it's too Jewish, right? How can a man of this stature and influence in the history of the church be so anti-Jewish? This is something, you know, books in the history of the church, again, would often omit, that is, to mention. Can a book of the Bible be so too Jewish, I want to ask? It's like entering a Chinese restaurant and saying, you know what, it's too Chinese here, right? And so what the person does is to ask the owner and the workers and the cook to live, right? Makes sense to you? This is what happened in the church history with the Jews. Especially when 75% of scriptures is a story of Israel from Genesis to Revelation. Can it be too Jewish when over 200 times in the Bible God is called the God of Israel? You cannot despise the Jews and read your Bible. It won't work. And I will tell you, it is right at this point in the book, after that Haman decided to kill all the Jews that God begins to perform some very powerful miracles, even some of the most unusual ones. First, see what this man of God, Mordecai, does. By the grace of God, Esther was already in the privileged position. She was already in the palace and the wife of the king. And the first thing that Mordecai does is to go to her and ask her to speak to the king on behalf of the Jewish people. At first, Esther resisted. Because anyone, even the wife of the king who came to him without being summoned, could be put to death. And she had not been called. So, being so young and inexperienced, she was afraid. But it is at this point that Mordecai sends her a message, a note, a strong note, which shows us the faith of this man. Look at chapter 4, verse 14. See what he says to her. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. What he's saying here is that if Esther did not do anything, God will act through other means. He was sure that God will act in favor of Israel no matter what. How did he know that? How did he know that God will surely come to the rescue of Israel? He knew his scriptures. He knew his Bible like any other good believer that he should. He must have known the promises of God to Israel given to Abraham. He must have known, like Daniel, who knew the prophecies of Jeremiah, which spoke of the deliverance will come after 70 years. He must have known the words of God in Isaiah and Amos and all these messianic prophecies. And I want to tell you something. See what the knowledge of God's word does to a man. It will affirm you. It will give you hope, even in the worst situations. This we learn from this book. Have we taken hold of God's promises? Have we experienced the power of God's promises? Have we yet noticed that all these men of faith, Mordecai, Habakkuk, Moses, Paul, were people who found themselves in circumstances where God seemed completely absent, yet their faith did not budge. Why? Because they knew him. They knew his promises, they knew his teaching, they knew his words. Yeshua said it. John 8:32. And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Right? Mordecai was in captivity, and yet he was free. He knew. His knowledge of the word and his faith freed him from the oppression. He knew God. He was convinced of his presence and protection. He was working along with the Spirit. This is whom the Spirit is looking for. People who know the word and have this faith. And God acts in this part of Esther in a most amazing way. It is from this point on where we see some extraordinary reversal of events. Watch now and see how God comes into action. As irrational as anti-Semitism is, so is God's response here so extraordinary. Let us go to chapter 6 right away. That right at the beginning of this chapter, we found out that one night, suddenly because he comes out of nowhere, one night for some unknown reason, the king could not sleep. And something even more astounding occurs. Look at verse 1. It says, that night the king could not sleep, so one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Why? We don't know where it comes from, right? How come the king could not sleep, and how did he come to ask to see the records, and what was in these records? There was recorded an incident which happened back in chapter 2, verse 21 to 23. We just read it like fast, right? When two persons plotted to kill the king, and guess who uncovered the plot? Mordecai. Actually, Mordecai saved the king. However, perhaps in the confusion or in his busy schedule, the king forgot to reward Mordecai. But God, in his perfect omniscience and timing, kept this for a more opportune time. Now suddenly, the king remembers. Did he have a dream? Maybe. I don't know. But whatever it is, God was in control. The rest is pure comedy, by the way. Okay, during the same evening, the king could not sleep. Haman plotted to kill Mordecai. While the king was looking to reward him, Haman was looking to kill him. And see what happens when in the morning after Haman went to the king. Okay? But as he entered the room, the king was wondering how to reward Mordecai, but Haman thought he wanted to reward him. Look at verse 6. It says, so Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me, right? That's Haman the Magnificent, remember? And thinking it is for himself, he gives the best advice. He asked that the person should be dressed with a royal robe and be paraded on horseback through the city. The king agreed and asked Haman to put Mordecai on a horse and to guide the horse. If you have to write a movie one day, this is it. This is it. There must have been laughter in heaven at that time, I'm sure, and for at least half an hour, right? Do you see how God can reverse a situation? Yes, he is not mentioned in this book, but he's there. He's there as he is with Israel, as he is with his own, always. It is after this event that Zeresh and Haman's friends came out with a deadly, serious observation. Look at verse 13, 6:13. This verse is a classic in the history of Israel, one of the most extraordinary in the Bible. This is what it says, Esther 6:13. When Haman told his wife Zeresh that all his friends, everything that had happened to him, his wife, his wise men that is, and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but surely fall before him. That's extraordinary, isn't it? That is quite a statement coming from the mouth of those who are not Jewish, and who had the Jews as captive in their country, and who also hated them. And this comes out of nowhere again, because just a day before, Zeresh and Haman's friends, advised Haman to make a gallows for Mordecai. Now, how did they change their mind? We don't know. Actually, we do. God was there. God was there. What they are saying is that if you fight the Jews, you will fall. This is the story of Balaam over again. He wanted to curse the Jews, but he could only bless them. And this is what Haman did to Mordecai. So did Zeresh and Haman's friends. They could not curse the Jews. And more than Balaam, they formulated this warning against all anti-Semite. You will not prevail against Israel, but you will surely fall. See how far this book brings us. You want to be on God's side? Love his people. Love his people. And there's one more situation that is funny. How did Esther save her people? She invited the king and Haman for a banquet, a wine banquet, and asked the king for a favor. So the king loved her so much that he said to her, I think it's repeated 3 times, I'll give you even half of my kingdom, right? And the king says, what are you asking? Okay, so she says to him, can you save my life and the life of my people? And the king says, what do you mean? Who wants to kill you? So she points to Haman, who decreed that all Jews must die, and I'm a Jew, she said to him. At this point, the king can't take it anymore. What he does, actually, try to imagine the scene. Okay, he goes outside in the garden to subside his anger. In the meantime, Haman begs Esther for mercy, and somehow he falls on her couch. And at the same time, the king comes into the room. And he says to her in verse 8, he says, will he also assault the king while I am in the house, right? What a comedy. What a comedy. See how God can turn a serious event into a very pleasant one. That was the end of Haman, by the way. To conclude, I want to ask you something. Did Jesus celebrate Purim? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Josephus, the first century historian, speaking of the Feast of Purim, he writes that all the Jews that are in the habitable earth kept these days festivals and sent portions to one another, right? They sent gifts to one another, just like Mordecai and Esther ordered. And Jesus was among them. And is this feast, and the second question I want to ask, is this feast mentioned in the New Testament? According to Edersheim, a Jewish believer and commentator from the 18th century, He looked into the chronology of the gospel and places Purim actually in John chapter 5, verse 1. He says, at this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Since this feast precedes the Passover, which happened 30 days after this event, it must only be Purim, he says. And I believe it. We do not have much time, of course, to go over this chapter of John, but here Israel is seen so far in chapter 5, so estranged from her God, just like in Esther. And yet he was there. He was with them in their midst. There we read that there was a certain man who was there who had an infirmity for 38 years. This is in verse 5. This man represents Israel in the wilderness, on their way to the promised land, a journey which never ended, for Israel never really reached this land of peace and rest. And here Yeshua comes to this infirm man, and to him he asks a question. And I believe he's asking everyone the same question. This is found in verse 6. So when Jesus saw him lying there, he knew that he already had been in that condition for a long time. And he said to him, do you want to be made well? Do you want to be healed? Jesus is asking, and he's asking the same question today. The message then is that Yeshua is really our Purim, right? He is salvation. He is the way to God. He is the key for salvation, the key for fine living. It is written in Romans chapter 10. Now, read these words. If you don't know Yeshua yet, read these words. It's very simple. Very simple, because there's no way we can go to heaven by ourselves. That if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in his heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. Perhaps today you want to give your life to him. By this time you perhaps understood who the God of the Bible is. Perhaps you know, and if you know, I want to tell you this is the Holy Spirit who's showing you these things. Like in Esther, did you know that he is the one who carried you all these years? Who cared for you all these past years? And today, by the way, you can invite him to your heart. You know, I will make the prayer of salvation if the Spirit inspires you to say it. If you feel this is the time in your life to accept Yeshua, wherever you are, just repeat this prayer with me. Yeshua, Jesus, today I give you my life. Today I recognize that you are the Lord of Lords, the only way to heaven. I know you died for my sins. And today, I give you my life. If you made this prayer, come and see me later. If you're far away, write me, because I want to start to pray for you. And for the congregation, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. May the Lord bless you. If you have any questions or comments, you can ask.